So welcome everybody to this session on 3D content in Europeana. Today we're inviting you to join a conversation about 3D content in Europeana and the common data space for cultural heritage. We'll be talking about the development of digital skills, the take-up of 3D technologies, and looking at ways of using and reusing 3D content, and how to accelerate the digitisation of monuments, historic buildings and museum objects. We hope our conversation today will encourage organisations to share their 3D content with Europeana. Just some housekeeping. We're recording this conversation, so please everybody mute your mics to begin. The panellists will each give a short presentation which will be followed by a discussion session. During the session, participants can ask questions of the panel by using the Zoom chat or the Zoom Q&A. So your panel today are myself, Kate Fernie. I'm the Operations Manager of Connecting Archaeology and Architecture in Europe. Then we have Fiona Moat, who's a data analyst at the Europeana Foundation. Sander Munster, who's a Junior Professor for Digital Humanities at the Friedrich Schiller University of Jena, Jill Cousins, the Director and CEO of the Hunt Museum in Limerick, and Marco Medici, who's an Assistant Professor at the University of Ferrara, the Department of Architecture, and also involved in the Inception startup company. So back in November 2021, the European Commission proposed the Common European Data Space for Cultural Heritage. As part of this proposal, member states were recommended to accelerate the digitisation of cultural heritage and to exploit 3D technologies. The challenge for us is to consider how to make the most of the opportunity of this recommendation and also how to make the most of the content that's being created. We can say that digital technology has become the new normal, especially since COVID-19. These days, ordinary people have access to devices that allow them to capture cultural heritage in 3D and to share their content widely. Yet across the cultural heritage and Europeana's network, people are at different stages. Some are very advanced and very expert, and some are just starting out. You're going to hear from some experts today. Really, the question is how we can share the expertise that we have between us and to actually build up the capacity of everyone. Because what we need to do is to capture the data in the best way possible so that it's able to be used and reused. We want to be able to add value to the content that we're creating. And even if it begins to be created for reasons of conservation and preservation, it also brings us opportunities to engage with communities in community capture or digitisation projects, to use the content in digital storytelling for education. We've got important research uses. It has great potential for tourism, for creative projects and all kinds of different innovations. And you're going to hear some examples of how this content can be used from the other speakers in this session. They'll talk about their projects and different uses and also the possibilities that come from having 3D content. So I'm going to hand over now to Fiona Moat, who'll speak about 3D from Europeana's perspective.
Thanks very much, Kate. Yeah, so as Kate's mentioned, and as a bit of a theme of this conference, we're entering the data space for cultural heritage in Europe. And this is going to be very important in the coming years, also for Europeana. So where does 3D fit into this data space? Well, it's actually going to be a very integral part of the data space. One of the things that we would really like from a Europeana perspective is more 3D content in our website. So at the moment, we have over 23,000 3D items in Europeana. And this sounds like a lot, but when you consider that our database is 62 million items, it's actually quite a small portion. It's about 0.2%. So one thing that we would really like is more 3D content. And why? Well, I'm going to share with you a couple of examples that I like from the Europeana website to give you an insight into how those objects can be reused and why they're important for us. So the first one is this castle from Slovenia. And this one has come into Europeana via the Weave project. So it's a project which ends at the end of September. And this project was involved in making an asset manager, which I've linked in the slide. So this asset manager actually gives cultural heritage professionals a way to host their 3D objects and also aggregate them to Europeana. And what do I like about this castle? Well, I think, as you can see, it gives a really interesting feel of what it would be like to experience the real life castle. And I think this could also be reused in tourism. And we have some generic services projects. So the Weave project is actually a generic services project. What those are projects that complement the core work of Europeana. And another one is Jewish heritage tours. And they're also exploring how to use 3D objects in a tourism setting to make these virtual tours. So I think this is something that we'll see a really interesting use of in the future. And this next object, this is a bit of a favorite of mine. This is quite a new object come to Europeana via Share 3D. We'll get to that in just a second. This is a grave altar, a Roman grave altar from the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. And the reason I really like this personally is because I actually wrote a PhD thesis on these monuments. And I'm not just going to geek out too much at the moment, but what I can say is that it's really exciting if you have a 3D model of a museum object like this, because you can see aspects of that object which are not usually recorded in a 2D medium. So for example, you can see the top of the object, you can actually see the carvings, how that's been carved. You can see the relief, and including in the inscription panel on the front there. And I think these are things that it's so hard to determine these from a 2D photograph. And it's something that ordinarily you would really have to go to the museum to see. But from this 3D model, you can really get a sense of something extra. And in Europeana, when these objects are aggregated together, you can also make your own gallery. So we have a feature called user galleries where you can favorite your items, put them in a gallery together, and use this for research. So for me, this is a really strong case for how you can use 3D models in research. The Share 3D tool, that was one that was also a result of a generic services project, and that allows cultural heritage professionals to store their objects on Sketchfab, but also then aggregate those using this tool into Europeana. So what I've shared with you today is a couple of examples of what you can get out of using 3D models, how you can use 3D models, why they're important to have in an aggregation platform like Europeana, and a couple of tools that cultural heritage professionals can use currently to aggregate their 3D models into Europeana. So now I would pass over to Sander. Thanks.
Yes, many thanks for that. And it's my pleasure, of course, to presenting some of the work we are doing in the JENA 4D research group. And the underlying idea in this research group is to not only looking on 3D from a technology perspective, but also to connecting to other fields, so community approaches, but also innovation models, cognition of 3D, teaching of 3D skills, and so on. And let me maybe in the next slide introduce some examples of our work. And one infrastructure we are currently luckily able to work on for a specifically German community under this foundation, or with some financing of the German Research Foundation, is the DFG 3D viewer. And this is a Sketchfab-like viewer infrastructure, which shall be able to connecting to multiple repositories, to working with these different libraries and other repository providers in Germany in order to enabling processing pipelines, but also to including multiple viewer components to aggregating 3D content and making it visible for a large community in architectural research, in architectural history, in art history, but also with regards to construction research and so on. Currently, we are with this project in a public alpha state with 50 models online yet. And we are now intensively preparing for the beta stage, which is hopefully ready in 2 months with some more models. Please feel most invited to checking it out on your own. The QR code can be found on this slide. In the next slide, I would love to introduce a project which is more or less not even a project, but maybe a kind of side activity. And in that case has been triggered by a request from our colleagues from ICOMOS, which were searching for a 3D digitization workflow on very low end in order to making people able to digitizing their heritage in risk by war, by natural threats, disasters, and so on. And in response to that, we developed a very simple digitization workflow, which is enabling people to take photos with their smartphones. So 20 to 30 photos are far enough in most cases to upload it on a website. And on our side, we have a server-based backend infrastructure to calculating 3D models out of this and pushing it into Sketchfab. So again, please feel most invited to also test it out. 3dheritage.de is the website. And in the next slide, I would love to introduce another, not single project, but a set of projects we are following on since, I would say, more or less 10 years. And the basic idea here is not to doing digitization and automated reconstruction of 3D models from contemporary sources, but from historical ones. And what we are developing in this 4D city visualization environment is, at the one hand, automated workflows for creating 4D scaled city models from both historical maps and also historical photographs, again collected and taken from Europeana, but also various other content providers, and making them accessible via a 4D viewer, which is capable to work in the browser on mobile devices. So we are now happy to have this application more or less ready also to work on a world scale, connecting to information from Wikipedia, for instance, but also other sources, Triposo for tourist information, for instance, and of course to making it available as a website. Again, please feel invited to test it out, and happy to hand over to the next in our round.
Hi everyone, I'm going to talk a little bit about 3D digitization and the use of that 3D digitization in the Hunt Museum. So my first slide tells you a little bit about how we've done it. So we've worked with a couple of small grants to pay for the expertise of people like John Beck from Scan the World. That included advice on how to work with scanners, rendering, and how to work with the different materials, showing us how it's done. We also have a group of volunteers who initially work with Digital Heritage Age in Ireland, and they come from the universities and the local community. We worked in particular with the Technology University of the Shannon, and the Limerick School of Art and Design and Games students. And currently we have one of them employed working on the more thorny digitisation of objects such as the dodecahedron, which is on the next slide. And this one made the top 10 in Sketchfab last week of all the objects in Sketchfab. The next slide tells you a little bit about the fact that we've loaded these onto, we have 215 objects. We started it 4 years ago. Doesn't sound like an awful lot to be done in 3D, but the whole collection's only 2,000. So to have 215 rendered as 3D objects isn't bad. They're all available on Sketchfab and Scan the World, and 100 are on Europeana as a result of the art of reading in the Middle Ages and the Europeana archaeology projects. The main work is always in the post-production in order to get the files to work well with good color and texture. So looking at the next slide and how we have used these objects, this is our augmented reality on Apollo. He's a 17th century German limewood. Apollo is the classical god of light, poetry and music, healing and prophecy. It was often used to represent the trades, arts and professions. In this AR version, which is based obviously on a 3D model, you see the trades. He's a hat and glove maker. He farms and he harvests. He is a carpenter. So he does blacksmithing, and I think there's a bit here where he does the gamekeeping and the fishing. The aim was very much to make him something that would engage people in the object, but also lead you around other objects in the museum. So once you'd looked at this on a tablet, you would be sort of inspired to go a little bit further. And if you wait a moment, he actually does dance. So he boogies as an augmented reality figure. And as I've said, he's got one of the best museum bums in the business. So he's worth visiting from the other side of him as well as this side. So moving on, we've also used our 3D objects to create a museum in the garden, taking objects that are in the museum outside the public realm and giving those who never come into a museum the opportunity to enjoy Old MacMahon. And he's really been taken to the heart of tourists and visitors alike. He gets a green and white sweater and scarf when Munster Rugby is playing, or when Limerick wins the All-Ireland hurling. He's made of tricoya, which is CNC cut, and actually he was painted with an anti-vandalism paint because he got all sorts of appendages. So moving on to the next example, we have teamed up with the Morpheus project for non-fungible tokens, so to generate some income out of what we have done in terms of the 3D objects. And I will say here that all of our 3D objects are available under the public domain or dedicated to the public domain. So regardless of that, Morpheus think there is a fungible market in this. I'm yet to see that. I am actually very interested in what they are doing in terms of using this technology in education. So it's based on PC use. You use these funny little glasses, and it means that you can use them throughout schools who do not have very upmarket technology. And during lockdown, we were very challenged with schools having PCs that would work with 3D models and the like. So this gives the ability to distribute 3D hologram experiences to engage the kids. And we also do that in a kind of online, offline way with Sketchfab. So our 3D animal hunt enables teachers to take children through our 3D collection of animals as part of primary school education, which is on Sketchfab. And then my last example here, and we have quite a lot more, but this one I'm quite pleased with. This is around the application of objects as 3D prints, and it's very much to improve accessibility. So for the visually impaired, and what you see here is people with their hands inside a black box playing with a 3D printed objects. They're listening to an audio recording about that object that's on Museum in a Box, and then they follow the coloured circles to see the objects in the museum. And we did this during Heritage Week, and there was a lot of fun by all sorts of people, as well as actually creating this idea of an accessible museum using 3D technology. So the scans are rendered as printed versions. And I'm going to hand you over to Marco.
Thank you very much, Jill. Now I will try to guide you through the inception technologies and what they can offer for the current integration with Europeana and the future data space. Inception is a startup company and a spin-off of the University of Ferrara. And what we developed is a software solution for the process of digitization, management, dissemination, and enhancement of cultural heritage. In particular, built heritage, so buildings, and also archaeological sites. We rely on BIM-based technologies and semantic web platforms. And so I will try to explain you a little bit better where are we coming from and what BIM is. So Inception is a spin-off of the university, but it was also a Horizon 2020 project developed between the 2015 and 2019. So in which we try to develop this overall approach to digital cultural heritage and offer this kind of software solution. We offer a web viewer in which we can upload BIM models. Why we need BIM models? We need BIM models when we are talking about buildings, because such kind of models can be segmented into different pieces, meaning that each piece of the building can be called in a different way, can be enriched with different pieces of information. And so it makes the model more accessible and even more useful for technical users that do not need an overall shape, but they need to distinguish into different parts. What we developed as a connection with Europeana was a way of enriching such kind of models without placing there new documents, new attachments, new piece of information, but using an existing platform for retrieving the knowledge that we already have about such kind of buildings. In this image here, you can see the Ospedale degli Innocenti, designed by Brunelleschi in Florence. And in this specific case, we selected one of the small decoration on the facade, and we tried to retrieve a solution or historical pictures already available through Europeana collections. So in this way, we are able to put knowledge and place knowledge within the model, relying on existing sources and existing information. What we need now is a way back for from the we can enrich the model with the knowledge on Europeana, but we need also to provide such kind of models to Europeana. When we are gonna do that, we are gonna do that for sure in the data space. Next slide, please. Just to mention that we are now exploiting such kind of power of the semantic web technologies on which all those kind of platforms make use of. even for connecting with national archives. In this specific case here, we connected with the new catalog for cultural heritage developed by the Central Institute for Cataloging and Documentation in Italy. And we tried also to extend a little bit the technology in order to include in a more consistent way even archaeological sites that up to now are a little bit tricky to be included into the BIM technologies. And as I was mentioning, this kind of technologies will be included also in next steps. Next steps are for sure the 4CH project, the Competence Center for the Conservation of Cultural Heritage, of which Inception is part, together with their partners. And I would also like to mention that Rara is also part of this project. And for sure, we will try, even thanks to the 4CH project and the new project in outer space, that will be participated by members of 4CH as well. We will try to bridge this kind of gap that I was just highlighting. So back to Kate now for the discussion session.
Okay, thank you very much, Marco. So now I'm going to put some questions to the panel and invite you to discuss them. So the first one is really thinking about how we can foster the development of new digital skills and the take-up of 3D technologies in the cultural heritage community. Jill, would you like to start?
Yep, from a museum point of view, it was the use of projects, people, and providing inspiration. So we made use of a couple of Europeana linked projects that catalyzed our previous efforts. But also we have made it part of somebody's job specification. So we have a digital collections coordinator who is responsible for 3D scanning, for uploading, and for printing. And then the take-up side of it comes from showing the possibilities. We now have 3 companies who have created 3D versions of the objects that we held in the museum. So you saw Old McMahon, this was done with the Electricity Supply Board and Arup. We also have a supersized version of a 5th century BC Etruscan bronze jug that has been recreated with Corton water jet cut steel by a company called Takumi, who are into precision engineering. And the last one, which I showed you, which is the dodecahedron, I'm really hoping that a company called Kirby Engineering want to reproduce that so that it will be big enough and safe enough for kids to crawl through. So it really is it's a kind of fostering it by doing, I suppose.
Okay, that's great. But maybe Sander, you could say something about from the university perspective in terms of skills development, working with students and maybe working with institutions to actually build up their skills.
With pleasure. So from a university's view, of course, one important issue here is how to scaling up to teach 3D technology competencies, specifically in the field of humanities. And this is something which is still, I think, very much not solved, and very much coupled also of the competencies of also the teachers in that case. So in our case, we are testing currently into 2 different directions. One is, of course, up to which extent this competency development and also teaching and skilling with 3D technology used in the humanities could be done in an unattended way. So therefore, we are conducting a large-scale campaign into Germany, thanks to the founding of a German ministry, with 10 universities in Germany, to testing out up to which extent video tutorials could work in a way to skilling humanities students so that they are capable to use 3D technologies, 3D modeling also in their courses, even under these conditions that no teacher is available in their specific courses which could supervise this. That's one strand. And the second strand related to that is also the question how to have access to high quality 3D teaching materials. And of course, there are many courses available in teaching 3D skills for specific software packages. But what is missing is to connect these things with the specific use cases in humanities, for instance, for modeling a historical cathedral, or what is specific if you would like to use 3D models to answer a specific research question in architectural history, for instance. And this is something where we, at the one hand, working on a European teaching and video tutorial platform dedicated to these kind of tutorials, but secondly, also to providing a kind of handbook as a starting point for scholars, for students in the humanities to dealing with that.
Thank you. Actually, I'd like to turn to Fiona for a minute, because one of the issues is actually the established professionals and maybe the older generation who've already done their university education, and how we actually enable them to access training and to develop their skills. So I wonder if Europeana has a perspective on that.
Thanks, Kate. I don't know about Europeana perspective, but I can give you my own opinion at least. So yeah, I think it's definitely important that we look at kind of breaking down some of the barriers to technologies in general, but especially 3D technologies, because I think that it can seem a bit overwhelming or daunting for people when they first come across it. 3D isn't something that we use in our normal lives, let's say, the same as we use perhaps 2D images where we WhatsApp them to each other. So I think, you know, there's something there where we have to kind of normalize a bit more 3D and make it more accessible. And from Europeana's perspective, something that we could do is make trainings about how to create 3D models, make those more available. And I really like, you know, the tool that Sander told us about as well. I mean, like, this is something that's, I think, could be used by anyone with a phone. So, you know, that's something that could really help anyone to start trying to create 3D models.
Okay, that's great. Actually, I think that leads us into the next question, which is all about acceleration of the digitisation of monuments, sites and objects, well, without losing quality, I guess. Marco, I wonder if you'd like to say something about this question.
Yes, for sure. Thank you very much, Kate. And yeah, I will try to reflect in first place on the term accelerate, in the sense that why we need to say that we need to accelerate. We need to accelerate when we look at the data related to how many objects now we have for the data space. And if we look at the recommendation, we see that most of the time we need to not only to double what we have done until now, but maybe even 5 times when I'm looking at the figures for Italy. So if we need to accelerate, most of the time it should be a matter of how we perform the digitization and why we do that. If we look at how, for sure, providing standards, procedures, standard formats, quality thresholds could be a way of looking at that. What Sander highlighted before, I mean, providing material for training is essential for accelerating in this direction. But at the same time, I would also say that when we are looking at how, we should think about even how to publish what we have already digitized, because most of the time we have, looking at institutions like universities, research centers, and whatever, we have in our storage a lot of data, 3D data that we can publish. So even accelerating on how to publish data, where to publish data, should be a topic to face. When we look at why we are digitizing, instead, we need to understand which is the use and reuse value, basically. So that's something that will lead at the next question, I know, but I would like already to mention that, in the sense that accelerating means providing good example of how we can use 3D data, and that could foster actually even the publishing efforts.
Yes, that's really an interesting point, because there is existing content that isn't being made accessible. So part of this question is about how can we remove barriers? And I'm wondering, Sander, if you had experience of working with researchers or institutions that have content, and then you need to find a way to remove the barrier to allow them to share it. Is it a matter of funding or clearing rights, or devoting some extra effort?
Yeah, many thanks for this question. Indeed, it's a matter of all of those aspects. So it's one first aspect is, of course, how these 3D objects are created in most of the projects. And that means that it is only in rare cases, or not in all cases, it is done by one single person only. But specifically in the humanities, it is often done in cross-disciplinary projects where, for instance, researchers which are specialized on the humanities aspects are cooperating with either companies or university players which are carrying out the digitization work and creating these models. And finally, it is also linked to a specific usage scenario. So for instance, the production of this content for having a film in the end, which could be shown in a museum or something similar. The problem here is, of course, that all those stakeholders here are having specific, I would say, requirements in sharing or preventing to share this content. And specifically, if working with companies, it's often this feedback we are receiving that this is very much, I would say, their core competency, and therefore they are not motivated, or it's not part of the contract for sharing this content, and it is more or less their core business. In case of museums or other institutions, we are sometimes, so lucky to hear about the exceptions from your museum, Jill. But in some cases, it is about, of course, having these things ready in the museum only, in order to preventing potential visitors to only seeing it in the web and not entering the museum, and all these kinds of maybe hurdles which are preventing people to sharing their content. So one facet here, or one issue, might be also how to motivate people to sharing here. And also this might be coupled to, at the one hand, bringing concrete benefits to people who are sharing, but secondly also to maybe enabling to a mode of sharing this content without preventing, for instance, losing a core competency or losing visitors to museums, and having best practices, but also secondly maybe some scaling options, like for instance in quality. Yeah.
Okay. Jill, I was wondering, we've spoken about the need for training, but you're commissioning 3D digitization, or you're working with companies, and there's a commissioning element to some of your projects. I wondered if there's a need for a specific competence around the commissioning of these projects to make sure that the content can be shared and can be released into the public domain?
I'm not sure it's about commissioning. I mean, I certainly agree with more training, because as soon as we train somebody up, they go and leave for the National Museum or something like that, which is good. We're spreading the word. I think I sort of like to answer the other sort of underlying question there, that it doesn't have to be perfect for most of the uses that we have for 3D digitization. And so we don't so much commission companies, we encourage them to take the 3D scans and use the materials that they normally work with in order to create something that can be used outside or can be used for the visually impaired and those kinds of things. So it's not so much a commissioning skill, it's a relationship skill. It's making people aware that it's possible. So for instance, for the we've done Olmec Man, but we've got other ones in the offing to do. I think it's more of that kind of level. It's about engagement. The other thing I probably say here is we could possibly do with another big campaign. So a wiki loves monuments. It could be a wiki loves creating 3D monuments. We use the technology that Sander has, and we do a quick training on how you go about doing it, and seeing whether we can actually have a big campaign that encourages people to go out and actually do it.
That's a really interesting idea. I'd like to bring Fiona into the discussion at this point. Do you think Europeana would be up to leading a campaign of that type, or to collaborating with someone or running a campaign?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that would be really interesting. I mean, we do really want more 3D items in Europeana, so I think we have to get the word out to people to either create them to accelerate this digitization, or to access the ones that already exist, and to tell people, you know, that we're interested in aggregating those objects.
Yeah, okay. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to move on to the next question, if you don't mind, which is related. The questions are all related, but Sander, would you like to say something about how we can encourage use and reuse of 3D content?
With pleasure. And I think we already started a little bit to discussing specifically these aspects of what might be hurdles from an organizational, but also from a technical point of view here. One thing I would love to briefly stress here is, of course, the question of a scenario which is in mind with regard of a reuse of this content. So aspects of course, these 3D content is mostly created and digitized with a specific set of quality, also described within a specific set of metadata. And what is needed, and this is where the data space, of course, is an important stone to create this or to continue here, is of course to make these 3D contents findable at one hand, but secondly also to linking it to different scenarios. So for instance, another quality is used and necessary if you are showing things on your mobile phone and would like to look like a street looks 100 years ago, or vice versa, doing an in-depth 3D printing, or doing also an inspection of a specific building with regards to BIM. And that is something, this variety of usage scenarios, which is definitely necessary to keep into mind with 3D content reusing.
Well, that's a really good point as well. Marco, do you have something that you would like to share on this topic?
Yes, for sure. And I will try to build on what Sander already said, basically. Indeed, he mentioned cross-disciplinary teams that need to perform the digitization. And I think that here is the key element in order to understand how to encourage use and reuse of 3D content. Indeed, when we are creating 3D content, we need to keep in mind that those content will be used by other people, and so we need different competencies for understanding what to digitize at what kind of a solution, which kind of data on state of conservation of materials, and how to document the history of such kind of element. And only creating this kind of synergy between different competencies and different skills, we can think about an effective use of 3D content. And reuse is strictly related to that. If we enrich a 3D model with different kind of information targeted for specific professionals, I think we can easily stimulate also the reuse of such contents. If we have just a 3D content, just a generic shape with a texture, I think it's not enough. We need to include to the creation of 3D content also the documentation part, in the sense of using in the right way metadata and additional information and documentation on 3D content.
Are there technical aspects which make it easier to reuse someone else's model? Does it all come down to documentation, or are there other aspects that are also important?
You mean for the technical use? No, I think not, in the sense that technical issues we can always solve somehow. If they are technical issues related to how data are structured. But if data are missing, we cannot do that. Of course, what we cannot improve later on is there a solution, but it's also if we took enough pictures or not. So yeah, when we are on field performing the campaign, maybe we should aim at the best quality possible. But if we have issues about technical quality related to original data or file formats or whatever, in that sense, we can always solve from the technological point of view.
That's always a good thing. That's great to hear, in fact, because I'd like to.
Okay, could I just add here, one of the things I think the data space should be doing is to provide a means of storing and backing up this data, because we do not have a publicly owned repository anywhere, and for a small museum that's impossible. So if you had it, so you had a data space that really had a repository that we could all use, people could download easily from, the licenses were in there, that would make everybody's reuse of this content a lot easier.
Yes, that's very true. That's a major challenge, and it's one that we're discussing in another session around Carrari's conference, which will also be available in a recording. But for now, because time's running quite short, I'd like to use that as a bridge to talking about how we encourage heritage organisations to share their content with Europeana. And if maybe Europeana needs to think about its offering, I guess, to organisations with 3D content, what it can do to help increase the amount that's coming in. So over to Fiona.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, no, absolutely agree with what everyone's been saying. And I think one thing we can do to encourage heritage organisations to share their content with Europeana is to make it easier to do so. And I mean, at the beginning, I was talking a little bit about some projects that we've had which have resulted in tools that cultural heritage institutions can use to share their content with Europeana. And I think that's something would be really great if we can look at taking that further, you know, towards something that can be used for hosting the Weave platform, as I mentioned. That's a good case for how we can see how that works. That's going to be really interesting because they also host the objects there. So I think that's something that, yeah, would be really important for the future. And also to reach out to the institutions who have the 3D content, to put them in touch with aggregators that we use at Europeana in order to publish things. So I think it's really important to get the word out and to make it as easy as possible and as clear as possible what kind of licenses are required and so on and so forth.
Well, of course, Karari is one of Europeana's aggregators for 3D, and so we do try and encourage heritage organisations to share their content. But I'm conscious that, for example, in Germany, there are infrastructure projects which are underway, which are looking at storage and metadata, and hopefully that can also help smooth the path of the content to Europeana. Sandra, I don't know if you want to say something fairly quickly. We're quite tight on time now.
Yeah, so indeed, it's this point how to bring up this great European movement we are having with this data spaces, also to a national, but also to a regional and maybe even a local and institution specific level. That might be it's a big challenge, of course, but also secondly, maybe it's a big chance in order to collecting these kind of content from multiple stakeholders, and of course, this embedding and this community building around this, that is, of course, a big challenge, but also great opportunities.
Yes, that's good. Jill, of course, there was another another Europeana generic services project, Common Culture, and the Digital Repository for Ireland has done some infrastructure development around 3D. So there are local possibilities that might be helpful to institutions in Ireland. And I think, in a way, one of the things that we need to do in our next steps is perhaps to gather more information about any of these national or regional developments that are going on, and make sure that that information's available to our network and our community, and to also to talk to those infrastructure projects about how to smooth the way of sharing the content with Europeana. And maybe that will be a great leap forwards for all of us.
Make sure they're linked together. I'd also recommend that we, in the same way as we do a kind of grassroots to get the content in on like a Wiki Loves, we might think about doing as we did to get the art into Europeana probably 8 years ago with the big art ride, where you are creating a publicity campaign around it at the very top level as to why encouraging the countries to participate in this, making sure that they were getting their organizations up to speed on it, that you've got a competitive element in the whole thing. And it made a big difference. The big art ride made a big difference to the amount of art 2D content that we had in Europeana and the quality of that. So I would have thought we could come up with something at the top down as opposed to the bottom up, on the basis that it was all meeting in the middle.
There are some really exciting ideas there for the future, and I'm looking forward to the year ahead and to developing some of them with you guys, but also with others as well from the network. But because I think I'd just like to invite each of you to say one final thing before we close the session. Marco.
Yes, thank you very much, Kate. I think that the discussion today was really interesting and at the same time quite challenging, because one of the latest idea that came out, for instance, the one of having a place for storage, for repository, most of the time is the elephant in the room. I mean, no one wants to talk about that because it's quite difficult, but we need to, I think we need to really reflect on such kind of point, because it will make the difference, having a clear idea on how to proceed further on, because I think that it's quite important to understand how we can preserve data, because we are creating a lot of knowledge, but we need to make sure that we are creating knowledge for someone. And so preserving data is one of the biggest challenge that we have had.
That's true. Sander, one final thing?
With pleasure. So I was thinking, or one point from my view is, of course, that 3D and 3D content and cultural heritage is, at the one hand, a very multifaceted field. Implicates or taking or needing legal implications, technical implications, also community and also usage context-specific implications, and so on and so on. That's one facet. The another vice versa perspective is also that 3D content for cultural heritage is not one single thing, but it's again a multiplicity of different usage scenarios, also of different content, of different media types, of different scaling, and so on and so on. And this is something which, at one hand, makes it really rich also and interesting as a field of usage, of application, of research, but also I would say with having in mind that to being able to cope with this complexity, we may have also something where Europe, as a very strong player related to cultural heritage, but secondly also Europeana, with this huge competency in dealing with that, may be able to play an exceptional role.
Oh, thank you. Jill, one final point?
I think I'd just like to emphasize the need to collaborate and work together. So really coming back to both Marco and Sander's points and Fiona's, that we don't create new silos for 3D content, which does mean a common digital repository for 3D content. And that might just mean that we need to link up the ones that are there properly.
Okay, that's an interesting challenge in its own right. And Fiona, one final point?
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone, I think, for their ideas, because I think we've got a lot of inspiration here. And I hope that my colleagues at Europeana will also take inspiration from this, and we can think about how we can improve things in the future. And I'm particularly looking forward to some great impact studies about these 3D models and things, and what kinds of users we can reach with those, and really encourage people to want to aggregate those. So not just have them on their own websites, but also to have them in the data space.
I agree totally. Thank you all very much for taking part in this discussion session. It's really been a great session. I've really enjoyed listening to everything that you've had to say, to seeing the examples that you shared. And I'm looking forward to the future, to seeing more content coming into Europeana, and also to the outcomes of the various projects that we're all involved in.